Hello, my name is Tejvan Pettinger from Economics Help, and today I'd like to look at factors that can cause a high wage economy. So the main factors that can drive up wages are economic growth, rising productivity, and a degree of collective bargaining which enables workers to get a good share of the profits. So I think the most important is economic growth, because when there is rising GDP, rising national income, it's very likely that, at least to some extent, workers will see a rise in wages, because when there's a bigger share of a pie, it's easier to give wage increases. And if you look at periods of rapid economic growth, the 1950s, 1960s, in Europe, US, Japan, then we see this is a period of rising real wages, very significant increase in incomes for ordinary people. And the rapid economic growth was a key factor behind this. Related to economic growth is labour productivity, and this is the output per worker. So when you get an increase in labour productivity, firms were able to pay workers more, because one worker, if they produce more goods or services, then a firm can pay more wages, but they get more output from that same cost of wages. So if you have improved technology in new working practices, this enables workers to produce more than previously. So when Henry Ford invented the assembly line, suddenly the average worker could produce a lot more cars. So Ford were getting more revenue and they could pay higher wages. So a key factor behind a high wage economy is being able to increase labour productivity through technology, through new working practices or better education and training. Another factor that is important for the distribution of income is the degree of bargaining power that workers have. If firms have quite a strong degree of monopsony power, then they're able to pay workers a lower wage, lower than the market equilibrium. And in the absence of any trade union or minimum wages, the workers may get a smaller share of total income. And that is also a factor that can lead to relatively low wages. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, trade unions were relatively strong in, say, the UK, Europe, and America. And this enabled workers to be able to bargain for higher wages. And by the 1970s, workers were getting quite a high share of national income. And in the past few decades, at least in the UK and the US, this has slipped back somewhat, perhaps because workers are less represented by unions, maybe firms have more monopsony power, but workers are starting to get a slightly smaller share of national income. A big question at the moment, especially in the UK, is the extent to which cutting immigration will lead to higher wages. Because from a theoretical point of view, if you reduce the supply of labour, then in theory this leads to higher wages. And if you have an acute shortage of workers, like the shortage of lorry drivers, it is very likely that wages will rise for lorry drivers. However, I would say that it's not that simple to say that if you cut immigration, wages go up, because there are many factors affecting wages. One important thing to bear in mind is that if you cut the supply of labour, because you cut immigration, then there'll also be a corresponding fall in demand for labour, because there's less people and so there's less demand in the economy. If you look at, say, America at the turn of the century, or America and Europe in the post-war period, this is a period of quite rapid immigration, but also rising real wages. So the immigrants coming in did increase the supply of labour, but wages, real wages, continued to rise because the economy was doing so well. And immigrants were kind of helping the economic growth because they were supplying more labour in expanding industries, but also creating their own demand. Now, if you looked at the effect of immigration in a recession, the effect may be quite different. Because if you get an increase in supply of workers when the economy is depressed, real wages definitely not going to rise. They may even fall. Now, in the UK, between the credit crunch of 2008 and say Brexit vote around 2017, 2018, there was quite high net immigration, but also it was a period of stagnant real wages. And so some point to this as an example of how immigration keeps wages low. And the thing to bear in mind is that because there are many factors affecting wages, it's hard to pinpoint which factor is having an effect. But the most striking feature that was causing low wages in the UK was probably the very poor productivity growth. It was unusually low. There was very little technological improvement or increase in labour productivity, and so wages were remaining low as an effect. And it's interesting to see how closely wages correspond to productivity growth. A good question is, what can the government do to create a high wage economy? And it's worth pointing out that there are many factors beyond the government's control. A lot of technological scientific breakthroughs are not something you can create just by higher government spending or new government policies. So in the post-war period, there was a kind of a wealth of technological improvements which made a real difference to productivity. We had containerization of shipping, bringing in of microchips, new working practices, just-in-time management. So all these were quite revolutionary in increasing productivity and enabling higher growth and higher wages. And in the past 10 years or so, this productivity growth has slowed down across the world. And can the government change this? Well, I would say it's very difficult. They can try, but to get a huge increase in productivity, you can't just magic it into existence. Some things the government could try is improved education and training, especially towards the qualification and skills that industry and business will need in the coming age. Because if workers are more skilled, then that's an effective way to increase labour productivity and increase wages. The government can also to some extent improve the infrastructure of a country, better transport, communications. So if you reduce congestion, it's quicker to transport goods and people, and that helps reduce costs for business. So that are some things that the government can do. You could also say perhaps free market supply side policies, possibly privatization, deregulation, may have a limited effect in increasing productivity, although the true effect is disputed about whether it's very high or quite marginal. Also quite important for the future, I feel, is the degree to which workers will be able to get a share of national income, because we're seeing economies evolve quite quickly, and we have a growth of dominant big tech companies, Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and workers which have high skilled and can work as a computer programmer may well be able to get quite high wages. But a big question is, what about those less skilled workers who used to do manual labor, and if they're replaced by a robot, will they be able to get a share of the new economy? And there is a degree to which the economy will create new jobs, and maybe in the service sector, which may be quite well paid, but there's no guarantee, because these new big tech companies have quite a degree of monopoly power, and they're quite profitable with a limited workforce. So already you are seeing companies like Apple and Amazon make very high revenue, very high profit, and this profit is being retained. It's not feeding through into higher wages for everybody, because they're making profit really from their monopoly power, their assets and their dominant market position. So this is a concern that rising national income doesn't necessarily translate into higher wages for everybody, higher incomes. And a big topic for the future may be the degree to which we need some form of universal basic income to help distribute the profit from tech to those who've kind of missed out on the economic developments.